So yes, uh, law is a creation of human agent. Okay. Uh, so law as it is should be separated from law as it ought to be. All these questions we have already discussed. Okay. Now, why do they do so? For three very important, reasons. Okay, three important virtues, I would say. Okay, that legal positivists, think are very important. Okay, so they also have a moral reason for legal positivism. So that's the difficulty in separating, positivism from, morality. Because at the end of the day, even the justification for positivism is also based on certain moral ideas. Okay, so they identify three important reasons. Okay, for which we need to separate law from morality. What are those? They say that clarity. Okay, we all disagree about what is morally right and morally wrong. So law cannot be based on our subjective understanding of morally right and morally wrong. So for the sake of clarity, so that we do not get confused by our subjective understandings of morality, you need legal positivism. Okay, so there is no question of differences in understanding there. Okay, then certainty in law. Legal positivism essentially says that law is as it is. Okay, you find it in the statutes or maybe common law as well for some, not for others. Okay, but then the idea is that you already know the law, you find it somewhere. Okay, so there is some kind of certainty in law. Okay, and yes, because most of the legal positivists insist that laid down laws are an important source of law, so statutory laws are an important source of law. So it's easy for one to access those laws. Okay, if you want to find out the law, you just go out there, take up the law book, and find it there. Okay, so these are the virtues which are very important for legal positivists, and they essentially their argument for legal positivism is based on these three that we will elaborate on later. And we also agreed that they say that morality can and do play a part in what in the with respect to the content of the law, but there is no necessary connection between law and morality. There could be contingent connection, but there is no necessary connection between law and morality. So when they say so, they say this, that the idea of justice, righteousness, democracy, rule of law, they do not have to necessarily determine a legal system. Okay, those are virtues which are very important. Okay, rule of law, when I'm using the word rule of law, I'm using it in a very substantive sense, not in a very formal sense. Okay, because some idea of rule of law is also possible in positivism that we will discuss later on, but the substantive idea of rule of law that many thinkers subscribe to, the positivists say that is not a necessary feature of a legal system. So yes, that's essentially what they say. So you may think that a law is unjust, that it is inefficient, that it is not judicious, that it is imprudent. Okay, but that your perception of law to be that does not invalidate the law. So the condition of validity of a law does not depend on its being just, does not depend on it being efficient, etc., etc. So that's essentially what positivism is all about. So we had already discussed that earlier. So we will add the introductory discussions here. Okay. Lots of other questions emerge from all this that we will take up. So today we take up the first legal positivist, first jurist. Okay, who claims himself to be a legal positivist. Okay. So as I told you, I'm not going into Hobbes. Hobbes, you guys can already study him, and you probably have studied him in your political science, classes. So we will start with Jeremy Bentham, because Jeremy Bentham is considered to be the true father of legal positivism. Although many consider John Austin as the one, but the problem was that the book in which our philosopher here, Jeremy Bentham, had elaborated on legal positivism was discovered much later at UCL. Okay, and John Austin had already written his book, which was published. Okay, so people credit John Austin because of early publication of his book, credit him as being the father of legal positivism. but he drew a lot of inspiration from previous works done by Jeremy Bentham. Okay, so that means that we should rightfully call Bentham as the originator of legal positivism. So apart from those differences, the problem is that quite often you are asked in the examination, and in India we have silly of MCQs in which they ask silly questions like who's the father of jurisprudence. Doesn't matter who really is, as long as you understand what they are saying. Okay, and that's not even a knowledge of jurisprudence. Okay, so anyway, but we are in a system where silly questions are asked. So I don't know what to tell you. Sometimes they ask you, they assume that it's John Austin. Sometimes they assume that it's Jeremy Bentham. So I hope they do not ask such confusing questions to you. But if you ask me who truly is, it is Bentham. Now why? Let's look at his work. Okay. Now Bentham, develops two different kinds of jurisprudence. Okay, remember these two names as you are quite often asked. Okay, two different kinds of jurisprudence. One is expositorial jurisprudence, and the other one is censorial jurisprudence. Okay, so those are expositorial jurisprudence, and the other one is censorial jurisprudence. Okay. Now, I should say that the censorial jurisprudence comes first, then comes expositorial jurisprudence, because the justification for expositorial jurisprudence emerges in censorial jurisprudence. Now, you will ask, what the hell is expositorial and censorial jurisprudence? Okay. So, essentially, as the name suggests, okay, expositorial jurisprudence exposits what the law is. Okay. So, that part of Bentham's jurisprudential work that deals with legal positivism, essentially the question what is law, okay, is his expositorial jurisprudence. Okay, his censorial jurisprudence is essentially his idea of utilitarianism that he had developed. Now one thing that you need to keep in mind is that his justification for legal positivism, that is his expositorial jurisprudence, lies in his philosophy of censorial jurisprudence, that is utilitarianism. So what I'm essentially in simpler words saying is that Bentham's justification for legal positivism lies in his philosophy of utilitarianism. Okay, why should we have legal positivism? That's what principle of utilitarianism says, as our philosopher would say here. So I hope these two terminologies are clear to you. Okay. Now there are two very important books that he had written. Okay, the first, the one that we credit him with, more often, is the book An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation. Okay, this is the book in which you will also find his principle of utility. Okay, and then there is another book by the name of Laws in General, which was discovered much later. Okay. I think published in the 1970s or something. Okay, so this is a different book. Okay, and it is also known by another name called Limits of Jurisprudence Determined. Okay, so if someone asks you who wrote the book Limits of Jurisprudence Determined, although Bentham himself didn't do it, okay, you will know that it is Jeremy Bentham. But if someone asks you who wrote the book The Province of Jurisprudence, defined, okay, that will be John Austin. Okay, so you have two here. One is Limits of Jurisprudence, the other one is Province of Jurisprudence. Limits of Jurisprudence is essentially the book of laws in general, okay, that Bentham had written. Now, as I told you, in the first book of An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation is the book in which he talks about his principle of his rule of utilitarianism, okay, his idea of utilitarianism. And it is in that book that he lays the foundation for the idea of legal positivism that he lays down, that he develops in much more elaborate manner in the second book by the known by the name of Laws in General, that we also know as Limits of Jurisprudence Defined. Okay. So in the first book, okay, he lays down the groundwork for the idea of legal positivism. So where he says that law, what is law? So he essentially deals with the question of law. So what is law? According to Bentham, he says, it is the expressed will of sovereign. Okay, what is law? Law is the expressed will of the sovereign. Okay, this is what he had, said in An Introduction to Principles of Morals and Legislation. Okay, so a theory of law essentially that he had developed. He defined it in terms of expressed will of sovereign. So keep these words in mind. Very short sentence, but conveys a lot. Okay. Now you will see the similarity of this guy with that of John Austin. So what is law according to John Austin? As we will study later on, he says that law is the command of sovereign. Okay. So in place of expressed will, Austin has used the word command. Now this leads to lots of differences, in their understanding of law that we will examine in a while. So yes, Bentham says in this book, An Introduction to Principles of Morals and Legislation, that law is the expressed will of the sovereign. Okay, so here he says that law is not a thing that you find somewhere. Okay, it is not a thing. Okay, like this book is. Okay, so it is a creation. Okay, it is a fictitious entity. Okay, which is socially constructed. So law itself is a social construction. It does not exist anywhere. Okay, common law as much a similar creation. Now Bentham had a particular disliking towards common law. He abhorred and detested common law. Okay, he was a lawyer, but he was not a successful lawyer. Okay, for it could be whatever reason it is. Okay, but the reason that he said is quite relevant. Okay, he said that he essentially found the legal practice as it existed then quite shady, in the sense that only judges know what the law is. As you know, in the common law legal system, it's the judges who lay down the law. Okay, so and the lawyers are supposed to in order to justify their case, produce precedents supporting their their case. So to him, it seems like a cartel-like business between the lawyers and the judges. So if you find yourself a place in there, then you can be successful, and if you don't, then you can't. So, and he found this to be a kind of corrupt system. So he had a abhorrence towards what common law is. Okay, so he didn't like common law. Okay, so he advocated for codified law. Okay, so that's why his position. That's the position of Jeremy Bentham on legal positivism. His legal positivism does not merely require that there is law. It should also be codified. It should also be in the form of statutes. Okay, it should not be in the form of common law. So unlike him, in Austin, you will see that Austin considers even judge-made laws, that is common laws, as laws. Okay, properly so called. So for Bentham, common law, which is an unpromulgated law, an uncodified body of rules, are not worthy of the name law. Even though we use the word law for common law, he says that these are not worthy of being called law. Okay, so therefore he supported codified laws or enacted laws. Okay, so when he talks about enactment of law, enactment of law. So how do we do that? Would it be just random law which is enacted, or should the law have certain content? So Bentham's answer to that question will be yes, there has to be certain content in the law. So how does the sovereign enact the legislation? The sovereign has to enact the legislation based on the utilitarian moral philosophy, and that's the work that he had done in the first book. So yes, a legislation has to be enacted, and if you want good law, it has to be based on the utilitarian moral philosophy. So if you're looking for social progress, if you are searching for justice, the only way to do that will be through the principle of utility, that is maximizing happiness. We will talk about that later on, because that's a separate topic altogether. So it's saying that you do not do justice based on this idea of natural law, natural rights, etc., which are not acceptable to him, why we will discuss. But you do it based on this clear principle that I'm laying down before you, that is the utilitarian moral principle. Okay, so I hope it is clear. Okay, now just so that you are not confused, okay, what utilitarianism is basically, I had already discussed this a little bit with you guys earlier. Okay, it's a consequentialist philosophy. Now utilitarianism is essentially an attempt. Okay, it's they want to, essentially Bentham wanted to make, moral science a kind of objective science. Okay, there has to be a scientific way of knowing what is the right thing to do. Okay, it cannot be merely metaphysics. Okay, it cannot be metaphysics. Okay, so he says that, he basically develops utilitarianism, which is an attempt to find objective science of society and politics. Okay, so utilitarianism is an objective science of society and politics, which is free from human subjectivity. Okay, we may disagree about other questions of morality if you trace it from, something that cannot be questioned. Okay, but here we can definitely question. Okay, so he says it's free from human subjectivity, as he hoped for. Our destiny is to become free from the contingencies of religion and historical accident. Okay, so he essentially found, his contemporary ideas of morality, which were essentially based on religion and other historical accident. Okay, he wanted to rid us of that. Okay, and he instead, in the place of, all that, he wanted to give us an objective science which we can use to come to, a right conclusion about what's the right thing to do. And that's his, principle of utility. We will discuss that, later, but for now, just remember, it essentially talks about the greatest good of the greatest number. Okay, that's the broad understanding. So, what law, you ought to enact the law, that has the tendency of increasing the happiness of a community. Okay, uh, so that's essentially what, principle of utilitarianism is. Now there are lots of varieties. We will, within that we will go into that later on. So I hope, this much is clear to you guys for now. Is it clear? Mm-hmm. So yes, so for now we know that, Bentham is the guy, who talked about, utilitarianism. He's the guy who also talked about legal positivism. We know that his idea of legal positivism, justification for positivism, is predicated on his principle of utilitarianism. Okay, he does not believe in common law. He in fact thinks that common law does not possess the quality of being called law. Okay, he does not think that natural law, natural rights, truly exist. Okay, if at all we are to come to right conclusion about what to do, then you have to use the utilitarian calculation. And when the legislators, okay, make the law, okay, they have to in fact use the principle of utility. Okay, and what is a law? It is the expressed will of the sovereign. So this is what we have learned so far. Okay, now from here, let's proceed to see, if you want to know a little more about utilitarianism at this stage, you will see in the book that I have shared. Okay, there's an entire paragraph, written on what is, principle of utility. Okay, so I will just, because we don't have much time, I think I should end it here with a little bit of introduction to principle of utility, which will need much more elaboration later on. And then tomorrow we start his definition of law. So today let's look at what it says. Okay, in that book that I had shared on page number 31, you will see the second, part. Okay, he is quoted here in his book, An Introduction to Principles of Morals and Legislation. He says, nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. Okay, so we are under the sovereign, under two sovereign masters. Those are pain and pleasure. So that tells you what you should do. Okay, so we instinctively know that, we go for, something that gives us pleasure, and we avoid that which gives us pain. So nature has already made the arrangement for us. Okay, that's what he's saying. So it is for them alone, okay, to point out what we ought to do. So only pain and pleasure will be able to tell us what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. Okay, so when it comes to enactment of legislation, okay, this will tell us, okay, what we shall do. Okay, on the one hand, the standard of right and wrong. On the other, the chain of cause and effects are facing to their throne. So both right and wrong and cause and effects are facing to pleasure and pain. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, in all we think. Okay, every effort we can make to throw off our subjection will serve but to demonstrate and confirm it. In order, in words of, in words, a man may pretend to exert their empire, but in reality he will remain subject to it all the time. The principle of utility recognizes this subjection and assumes it for the foundation of that system, the object of which is to rear the fabric of felicity by the hands of reason and law and of law. Systems which attempt to question it deals in sounds instead of sense, in caprice instead of reason, in darkness instead of light. So he's saying that only moral philosophy, which can be accepted is utilitarianism, nothing else. The rest is just nonsense. Okay. So one might say, for example, that I do not enjoy worldly pleasure. Okay, I do not enjoy worldly pleasure. I don't want a BMW. I don't want fancy food. I just want to, live a reclusive life. Okay, so so it seems that in a person who makes such an assertion seems to negate, Bentham's principle of utilitarianism. Okay, because that person abjures, okay, pleasure. But Bentham would say that you are still seeking pleasure. The pleasure might be of different kind, but what you desire, okay, desire of being alone somewhere in the mountains or being locked, locked inside the room, those are also desires, okay, and those are also a kind of pleasures, okay, that you are seeking. So it's all at the end of the day are all about pleasures, okay. So even when you give up your dreams of, you do not want a BMW, or even when you do not want fancy clothes, food, okay, you want something else, okay, but you are still driven by a pleasure. It's a different pleasure, but pleasure nonetheless, okay. So it's only pleasure and pain that can help us, in determining what we ought to do and what we shall do. So that's his principle. So he essentially says that, the principle of utility states that an action ought to be approved or disapproved according to its tendency to increase or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question. So what he's saying that, when you take a practical action, okay, whether I should do it or not, you will look at, whether your action has the tendency of increasing happiness over that of pain, okay. When the state is to make law, it will also look at whether this law or policy that it is going to make will have the tendency of increasing the pleasure over that of the pain. Okay. If that is the tendency, then you are doing the right thing. Simplifying it, it has lots of other, complicated issues that we will discuss later on when we talk about utilitarianism. So that's it. That's the end of our discussion for today.